For centuries, the Ottoman Empire was a giant of its time, building vast lands and new laws. It brought order to many. Yet, for the countless men, women, and children who found themselves on the wrong side of an Ottoman siege, this order meant something else entirely. Their hopes for safety shattered, replaced by a legal system that often demanded permanent loss or cruel punishment. Two very different worlds, existing side by side. So what decided whether you lived, died, or lost everything you owned? For civilians caught in a siege, it often came down to one simple choice: surrender peacefully or be taken by force. If a city negotiated a deal and opened its gates, its people were usually granted protection. But if the Ottoman army had to fight its way in, that promise was gone. Instead, the law basically said that looting the city and enslaving its people was the soldiers' rightful reward for victory. A dark example of this is the siege of Otranto in Italy. After the city was captured, the traditional story says over 800 men were executed for refusing to convert. While today, some historians think most were sold into slavery, the outcome was still brutal. Resistance had a terrible price. So what were the laws and rules that justified these actions, and how did they shape the grim reality for survivors? It was a well-defined system, based on both Islamic law and military custom, and it all hinged on one critical moment. The entire fate of a city was decided by how it responded to the Ottoman army's arrival. Think of it like a legal switch. If the city's leaders negotiated a deal and opened their gates, that switch was flipped to safe. They were granted what's known as aman, a formal promise of security. This meant the people and their property were legally protected from harm. As long as they held up their end of the deal, they would be safely brought into the empire. But if a city chose to resist, that promise was never made. If the Ottoman soldiers had to climb the walls, break down the gates, and fight street to street, the situation changed completely. Once the city was taken by force, it was considered a legitimate prize of war. The most famous example of this is the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The city fought to the very end and never negotiated a surrender. So when Sultan Mehmed II finally conquered it, he followed the custom. He granted his troops a period of plunder, turning the once great capital over to them as their prize. For the survivors, this legal distinction meant everything. Constantinople was not just another city. For more than 1,000 years, it had been one of the most important capitals on Earth. It sat at the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, controlling access between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Whoever held the city controlled major trade routes, military movement, and the flow of wealth between continents. It was the former capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and a center of Christian political and religious authority. Its walls were legendary, its population dense, and its symbolic value immense. To conquer Constantinople was to announce the end of one world and the beginning of another. For the Ottomans, taking the city was a declaration of imperial legitimacy. The fall of Constantinople transformed the Ottoman state from a regional power into a global empire, and it signaled to Europe, the Middle East, and beyond that, a new center of authority had arrived. For the survivors inside the city walls, their legal status had vanished. They were no longer citizens. They were property. This process of enslavement wasn't just chaos. It was a cold, calculated part of the war economy. Families were torn apart on the spot. People were lined up and sorted, their value judged by their age, health, and skills. Many were marched away to be sold in slave markets hundreds of miles from home. In fact, some modern historians argue that this hunt for human captives was a primary driver of Ottoman expansion, especially into the Balkans. Conquering a new territory wasn't just about gaining land. It was about harvesting its most valuable resource, its people. But not every captive was sold off to a private owner. The empire often kept the best for itself. Skilled craftsmen might be sent to work on the Sultan's grand building projects. Strong young men could be forced into the army's labor units, and sometimes the state's needs were even more specific and grim. After a devastating naval defeat at Lepanto in 1571, The Ottomans desperately needed to rebuild their fleet. The solution? Thousands of prisoners of war were sent straight to the shipyards and chained to the oars of new galleys. They became the human engines for the empire's war machine. Yet even that pales in comparison to the most systematic institution of all, the devshirme. This was a planned, recurring event, a human tax levied on conquered Christian communities. Periodically, Ottoman officers would arrive in a village and inspect the local boys. They would select the strongest, healthiest, and most intelligent children, tear them away from their parents, and transport them to the capital. There, they were forced to convert to Islam and put through years of grueling training. The goal was to create a new class of men completely loyal to the Sultan and nothing else. They had no family ties, no regional loyalties. They owed their entire lives and their powerful new careers to him. Official decrees warned that anyone who resisted would be executed. It was a perfect and perfectly brutal system for turning the children of the conquered into the empire's most loyal servants. Once a city fell, Ottoman power had to be made brutally, undeniably clear, and this was often done through carefully planned terror. The punishments weren't just about justice. They were designed to have a massive psychological impact to make sure nobody ever considered rebellion again. One of the most dreaded methods was impalement. It was a slow and agonizing death specifically used to punish people for treason or spying. Its purpose was to serve as a public warning, a horrifying spectacle to discourage anyone else from trying the same thing. And these warnings were impossible to ignore. In the capital of Istanbul, right at the front gate of the Sultan's Topkapi Palace, the price of dissent was put on full display. Historical accounts describe the gate being covered with the severed heads of recently executed criminals. Sometimes there were even piles of other body parts, noses, ears, and tongues, left as a constant, grim reminder of the state's power. As one 16th century official proudly wrote, "The laws were made to slam shut the gates of oppression and aggression." The death penalty was the answer for a whole list of crimes that threatened the state. This included arson, repeated theft, and, most importantly, any act of disobedience against the Sultan. And the scale of these executions shows just how central they were to maintaining control. During the reign of Sultan Selim I in the 16th century, it's estimated that over 30,000 people were executed, and that was in just 8 years. It was a clear and bloody message. The Sultan's will was absolute, and it would be enforced by any means necessary. Every part of the system, from the laws of surrender to the brutal punishments, was a tool. They used these tools to expand their lands and keep people in line.